This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through all the business news stories you need to know about from Africa and beyond. Let's start with a quick run through the markets for you. Some interesting developments in Kenya today. The head of state basically saying, look, I'm not going to be assenting to the 2019 finance bill, which would have essentially kept rate caps in place for a long time to come. And bank stocks clearly loved that particular statement. Essentially, we're seeing stocks going up by almost 4 to 5%. We'll be exploring the implications of this policy, both on monetary policy but also future growth down the line a little later in the hour. Here's what's coming up tonight. Nigeria's debt is increasing at an alarming rate. We'll look at the latest numbers. Kenya's president rejects a bill that wants to retain caps on interest rates. And the UK inches closer to leaving the EU after a last-minute agreement on Brexit. Our starting point tonight, though, is Nigeria, specifically Nigeria's public debt. It's gone up by about $9 billion to $71 billion in the last 3 months, compared to $61.8 billion at the end of 2018. Now, the country's debt obligations went up by $2 billion, with the government paying more than $2.5 billion in servicing the multiple plans that it has, both foreign and domestic, in the first half of the year. The total domestic debt currently stands at about $48 billion, including, of course, federal government bonds, Nigerian treasury bills and promissory notes. Contrarily, however, external debt components are made up of multilateral debt worth about $12.7 billion. Analysts have been warning that the country's debt load could rise to at least $75 billion, considering the current deficit and the budget that has been presented by the President, Muhammadu Buhari. Deji Badmus joins us now live from Lagos. He's got more data on this story. So, Deji, let's start with the broad picture here. Nigeria's debt levels still remain pretty elevated, but what exactly is the majority of this debt for? What is it doing for the Nigerian public?
What I'll tell you, Ramah, is let's start from 2015 to this period. The bulk of Nigeria's debt, the bulk of Nigerian borrowing had actually been tied to project, going into capital project. But before 2015, there were periods when the country actually borrowed to pay salaries, basically to fund the recurrent expenditure of the budget, pay salaries and other overheads. But from 2015 to this period, the bulk of the borrowing the government has actually taken, or the bulk of the debt now it's taking has actually gone into capital project. So that's the reason why, for instance, you can see the government embarking on some very ambitious projects, not just ambitious, but quite expensive. You talk about the railway, for instance, the massive railway project that the government is carrying out. Part of the money is going into that. Part of the money is also going into the construction of about 5 airport terminals as we speak. I think one of them has actually been completed and commissioned. There's another one, the one in Lagos will be commissioned very soon. So 5 of them terminals, and we understand that is costing the country around $500 million each. And then we also have money going into massive road projects. You have electricity as well. So the bulk of the borrowing we've seen between 2015 and now has actually gone to capital projects, especially when you talk about the external borrowing now. And so that's where the money has actually been going to. But prior 2015, we actually borrowed to pay salaries.
Right, so as a percentage of federal government revenues, though, debt service costs are taking up more than 60% of available revenues, and that's only forecast to fall to 50%, which is still high, in the next fiscal year. Why is this so high, and is there a plan perhaps to restructure some of the Nigerian debt, particularly the foreign component of it?
First, let's talk about the foreign component of the debt now. It's actually not a problem, as we speak today, because the figures actually came out, I think, yesterday. The Debt Management Office actually said the domestic component now of, I'm talking about the external component now of the debt is about 27.1 $1 billion. Now, if you juxtapose that with the domestic debt of $56.72 billion, then you know Nigeria really does not have so much of a problem with its external debt. The area is the domestic debt because, you know, domestic borrowing is quite expensive. At some point, the government, of course, borrows at 14, 15% just to attract, of course, you know, to attract foreign exchange. So domestic is actually a problem, and that's the reason the government is trying to balance the whole thing. It's trying to achieve a 60%, 40%, you know, a ratio now in terms of domestic to external. Now, no doubt, you talked about revenue, and that's what the government has continued to maintain, that the problem Nigeria has at the moment is actually not debt related. That the problem it has, it's revenue. That it's not as if the government's debt is not manageable, but that the problem the government has is, you know, revenue. For instance, look at budget 2018, the revenue performance, just around 55%. 2019, the last figure we got was just about 40-something%, not very good. And the expectation is that by the end of the year, there's a possibility that the revenue performance may still not exceed 55%. So the challenge is how to raise money. It's a big challenge. That's the reason why for 2020, you can see the deficit is quite huge. And is the reason why the government is looking at different ways to generate revenue. For instance, it just increased, it just announced that it will be increasing VAT now by 2.5%. It's also looking at other measures to raise money. So the challenge that the country has, to be candid, is a revenue. If it's able to generate enough revenue, and that's what the government is saying, that its debt is actually sustainable. It's actually not gone beyond the threshold that the Debt Management Office has actually set. Ramah? Right.
Okay. One other thing, the oil sector, that's also been in focus today. The oil minister essentially saying that Nigeria can't recover the over $60 billion that it's claiming from oil companies, or OMCs, the Shells, the Chevrons, the ExxonMobils, even though the law allows states to revisit production sharing contracts if prices go above a certain point. Why is this the case?
To be candid, I must tell you, I was surprised to hear the, you know, the Minister of State for Petroleum now say that, because as we speak, I mean, this case is in court. Some of the oil majors are actually taking the government now to court over this issue. One would have thought that the minister should have probably waited for the courts to rule before just concluding that it's not possible for Nigeria to recover, you know, that amount of money. But somehow I think there's a sense in what the minister, you know, actually said. And what he was actually trying to point out was that, look, Nigeria left it too late. Of course, they have this law. You know, just imagine the last time oil sold for $20 per barrel. Just imagine the last time. So what prevented the country when the price of oil went beyond that threshold of $20? What prevented the country, the government now, from going to these oil majors to say, look, the price has gone beyond $20, so let's review the production sharing contract? Why did the government have to wait until this time? And so you look at that, and you look at the prevailing situation in the oil industry. There's, for instance, there's no, the petroleum industry bill is still before the National Assembly. So basically it's like you don't have that governance structure now in the oil industry. So I think when the minister said that, he was basically looking at all of this. For instance, the fact that there's no petroleum industry governance bill in place, and that, you know, the country left it too late. So even if the country would recover some money, it will be difficult to recover that huge amount of money. Now I'm talking about the $62 billion we're talking about here.
It's an enormous sum.
And of course, you know, that's the reason why the oil majors are actually, yes, it's enormous amount of money. And that's why the oil majors are doing everything to ensure that even if they pay, they do not pay up to that. And that's why they're in court.
Right, we'll see how this plays out. Thank you for that. That's Dejiban was there live in Lagos. Now, the 8th edition of the Zimtrade Annual Exporters Conference is underway in Bulawayo. More than 250 local and foreign delegates are at this business event, which has been organized by the country's National Trade and Development Promotion Agency, Zimtrade. As CGTN's Ramah Nyang now reports, the message coming out of this annual exporter conference is it's not really business as usual, but a rethink is needed in how to do business in Zimbabwe.
What Honorable Moy did.
These are the geese laying the golden eggs. Some of the country's top exporters who are earning much needed but still scarce foreign currency. The current economic turbulence means the export business isn't for the faint-hearted.
Increased costs that are creeping up are not making it easy locally. So breaking even locally is actually a nightmare. So we have to keep pushing exports as hard as it is. We definitely need a lot of export incentives. They need to come back so that we can push our exports. We need solutions for power because we end up using generators, which is extremely expensive.
Despite that, they soldier on and are seen helping to circumvent financial sanctions that have frozen some payments destined for Zimbabwe.
Our current position, therefore, calls for robust, innovative, collaborative strategies and efforts to build productive capacity and generate value-added exports, and find more innovative ways to effect payments out and payments in.
That innovativeness requires rethinking and reforming, an appropriate theme for this year's conference.
It forces us to challenge ourselves and to say, okay, fine, yes, I need electricity, but is there an alternate way that I can get energy? I need ABCD. Is there an alternative way that I can actually do it? And what you're actually finding happening right now in the economy is that a number of the exporters have realized that they have to think differently within these areas, and they've started thinking differently, and therefore they've been successful.
With conditions far from ideal and economic headwinds battering the country, now's the time to circle the wagons to grow exports.
If everybody comes together and it's a collective effort, and I think the President in today's presentation, he was very clear that it's not just about one party coming to the table. All parties have to come to the table. And if all parties come to the table, that is very, very achievable.
Zimbabwe is targeting to increase export revenue to $7 billion from the current $4 billion by 2023. Ramah Nyang, CGTN, Bulawayo, Zimbabwe.
And we're still in Zimbabwe. The country has cancelled a deal struck with the South African logistics group Transnet and its partner. Now, that agreement has been struck to recapitalise the state-owned National Railways of Zimbabwe, or NRZ, citing a failure, apparently, by one of the parties to meet its obligations. Now, back in August 2017, Transnet and the Diaspora Infrastructure Development Group, or DIDG, won the bid to recapitalise the firm with an estimated $400 million in capital required. According to reports, the consortium, however, has missed several timelines to provide proof of funding. It also adds that differences seem to have emerged between the consortium partners, and that in turn led to DIDG presenting a funding structure that excluded Transnet altogether. The NRZ is one of the largest employers in Zimbabwe. However, its fortunes did decrease after an economic crisis between the year 2000 and 2008 that nearly halved the size of the country's economy. Let's get a little more details on this particular story. CGTN's Ramah Nyang is live in Bulawayo. He joins us now from that very city. So very briefly, Farai, what exactly was the intended plan? Once Transnet and DIDG won the tender to recapitalise Zimbabwean rail, then what?
Well, Ramah, once they won that tender, they were then expected to provide some funding that would then go towards putting in a new infrastructure, putting in place new wagons, amongst other things. But if I take you back to that time, back in 2017, when this tender was floated and then awarded to the consortium, there was also then a requirement for a due diligence exercise, which was mutually to be done, and that was to be undertaken. But also, the structure was meant to be a joint venture company that was to be set up, including the consortium and the NRZ going forward, and that is the vehicle that that would then get funding and start to operate the railways essentially, and the dividends being derived from those operations is what the NRZ would then use in order for it to start to extinguish and service some of its debt. So unfortunately, this relationship has broken down before this due diligence exercise and amongst other things had been undertaken. But we do know that under a separate framework that had been agreed, some wagons had been provided from Transnet, as well as some work was being done to repair and put in place railway sleepers along one of the railway lines from Bulawayo, where I am, to Beitbridge at the border with South Africa. But that was under a separate framework. But essentially the main deal, which was to put funding into NRZ for its working capital, as well as to equip it to be able to resuscitate its operations, has broken down, and that is where we are, unfortunately.
Right, so the government did say that one of the consortium partners, DIDG in this case, was not able to provide proof of funding. But this sounded rather curious to me, because this is something that should have been verified at the very least before the tender was awarded to the consortium. Shouldn't that, that's usually how it's done, no?
Indeed, Ramah, that is how usually it's, it is done. And unfortunately, what is unfolding here is a situation of he said, she said, because when you speak to the promoters, the executive chairman of the DIDG has been on record as saying that they had secured funding or, proof of funding from the Pan-African lender, Afrexim Bank. They were looking to raise about $420 million US. Part of that, about 80 million, was to be raised through DIDG, his own investments, and the rest was to come from Afrexim Bank. And they say that they had term sheets from Afrexim Bank, which was proof enough or evidence enough that the bank wouldn't go to that extent of coming up with term sheets if it was not going to fund this project. I think where they say this fell, where the fallout comes from is the government or the Minister of Transport expected to see physical funds, physical money put into the bank account of the NRZ to prove that indeed there were funds that were available. But as I had mentioned earlier, the structure was that it was meant to be a joint venture company, and the feeling was that any funds that had been put into the NRZ directly would have been, would have gone towards extinguishing, would have been swallowed because of that debt. So that is the point of the fallout. DIDG says that it had secured the funding or proof of funding. It had people who were ready to fund it. The government is saying, show us the money, put the money in our bank account, or certainly in NRZ's bank account, and that is the position where we are seeing this fallout, Ramah.
Indeed, bureaucracy wars. So now that this thing has fallen apart, to essentially quote Achebe, what happens next?
Mm-hmm. Well, the government statement says that it will refloat the tender, and all interested parties, including those who were considered previously, are also open to apply and will be judged fairly and accordingly. There was quite a bit of interest from a number of potential suitors when this tender was floated back in 2017. So we expect that we'll have a number of players who will want to throw their hats in the ring and bid for this. However, before we even get to that, I would also imagine that this DIDG consortium may want to pursue legal recourse. I think given the amount of work that they had put into this, and also the fact that they are standing by their guns, that they had met their obligations, had approved funding, I would expect that they may pursue legal recourse. And so, Ramah, this may be headed to the courts, unfortunately. And it is unfortunate because what government was looking for here was a quick win. This was one example of a deal, an infrastructure deal that it had been touting as an example of the quick turnaround that this new dispensation could achieve, and it was being driven by its diaspora, a community that Zimbabwe has been trying to get involved in the economic turnaround. So unfortunately the deal has collapsed, and unfortunately if this ends up in the courts, then it will take a lot longer, and that turnaround of this very crucial state enterprise may not happen.
Indeed, let's see how all of this does play out in the courts and outside it. CGTN's Farai Makutuya there live in Bulawayo. All right, then a quick run through some corporate headlines. Royal Dutch Shell is planning to start its operations in concession areas in Egypt in the second half of 2020. The firm is among the oil majors that won a total of 12 tenders, as Egypt is looking to sustain its investment upswing, spurred by a whole range of major hydrocarbon discoveries. Shell has also applied to take part in a bidding round for oil and gas drilling in the Red Sea in efforts to expand its operations. Old Mutual Zimbabwe has offered its employees an improved retrenchment package after its first offer was declined. The insurance giant rolled out a voluntary retrenchment scheme in a bid to manage costs in a deteriorating economic environment. The response was considered to be well below expectations due to the high inflation rate in the country. The Nigerian-based firm Continental Reinsurance will offer agricultural insurance cover in its latest product portfolio. This marks its entry into a class that has experienced high loss ratios in markets like Kenya. Now, the company says that Africa has enormous potential to grow its agricultural sector, but that requires a lot more insurance to come into play as well. The cover will help deepen the Kenyan agricultural insurance, where annual gross written premiums are below $10 million. And finally, on the hardware front, Google has unveiled its new Pixel smartphones with high-quality cameras, a radar sensor, and a faster virtual assistant, most of which is built into the phone. However, it failed to provide enough to set the devices apart from rivals and nixed concerns about price. The firm also announced its first moderately priced laptop, its first wireless earbuds, an upgrade to its well-reviewed Wi-Fi router, and a burger-sized smart speaker. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. The Kenyan president has rejected a bill that wants to retain caps on interest rates. We'll examine the implications next. And South African firms are scaling back their growth forecasts. We'll tell you why when we come back.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible? And why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Zimtrade. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business. Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Data out of the country. The country's foreign currency reserves.
With a dedicated and diverse team of anchors, CGTN now brings Africa to the palm of your hand.
I'm Perina Karibe in the heart of Nairobi, which is bustling.
From everyday heroes to the continent's most powerful figures, we bring their voices to you.
We haven't changed. And this is something most of us are very excited about.
We bring you news that's changing perspectives.
I'm Michel Barnier reporting from Nairobi's city center.
News that brings Africa to the world. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to the program. Kenya's head of state has rejected a bill that seeks to retain caps on interest rates. Instead, Mr. Uhuru Kenyatta wants lawmakers to scrap commercial lending rate caps, which critics point out have essentially triggered a credit squeeze. Mr. Kenyatta is in agreement with the country's finance ministry as well as the central bank. Their argument, and the data backs them up, is that the cap has cut private sector loan growth. And they argue that banks have essentially avoided lending to customers because it simply doesn't make economic sense to do so. In 2016, the Kenyan government limited the rates banks can charge consumers to 4 percentage points above the central bank's policy rate. Right now, that's at 9%. However, if lawmakers do agree with the president's memo, banks will now have the freedom to price their credit facilities based on a risk assessment of their clients. So let's examine this in a bit more detail. George Bodo is a director at Call Street Research and Analytics, is with me in studio tonight. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Mike.
So initial impressions, other than I told you so, because we've had that conversation for the last 3 years?
It was a surprise. It was a surprise, actually.
Why? Why, though?
Because we didn't, and I didn't expect the president to send a memo back. But I saw that this bill was sent to the State House on the 26th of September. Ideally, I saw 13 days, no action. I figured out there was a memo coming back. Yeah.
Right, but at the end of the day, there was some really interesting language coming through here.
Yeah.
There was specific emphasis, for instance, on unintended consequences. And one of the things that he pointed out later on in the memo was that we were seeing the rise of Shylock lending, which is a little ironic. But should we take that as a preview of a crackdown on that market segment?
Well, I have a different view on that. But I think before we get that, I need to understand that the finance bill in itself is actually all the revenue-raising measures to fund a spending plan. So essentially, Treasury originates these revenue-raising measures, lays out an ambitious spending plan, takes it to Parliament, tells Parliament this is how I intend to fund the budget, please approve this, and that forms the bill. Now the bill is passed through Parliament and through our normal legislative process, passes through Parliament and then goes to the President for signing. Now, how does the point of rejection is the fact that the bill itself is what we call an omnibus bill. What it means is that the Treasury can pack all sorts of other miscellaneous amendments with the bill.
Which they always do.
Which
because
they
it covers
always
everything.
do.
Income taxes,
And
excise laws,
all these things.
the lot.
And all other amendments, laws, amendments related to the financial sector are all packed in the finance bill. Now, this proposal to repeal Section 33B of the Banking Amendment Act was part of those miscellaneous amendments. Now, I think, do you want to, my argument is that, do we want to be holding a very crucial bill, as crucial as finance bill, right, which contains revenue-raising measures, which, by the way, is supposed to be enforced by October 1st, is being held hostage by a miscellaneous amendment. That's an anomaly in my assessment. Now, back to your question. I think that one of the things the President cited was that mushrooming of what we call
well, Shylock lenders. Shylock is actually the word he used. Shylock lenders.
Shylock lending. It's a response to a gap in the market, right? And the fact that the President is asking MPs to delete that clause, I don't think it guarantees that that segment of the market will go away. It has always existed anyway.
Because at the end of the day, he can't legitimately say that it's a problem, yet we know that some of the big banks in this country are also lending essentially at what qualify as Shylock rates.
It's a weak point in my assessment, yeah.
So what happens next?
So what happens next is obviously goes back to Parliament. The Parliament will look at the memo. Yeah? They have about 14 days, I think, to vote. So to overturn that, they need 2/3.
Do you think they'll raise it?
No, they'll not raise it.
Why? Why not?
Because the way the Parliament is structured right now, and I have a problem with the structure of Parliament today. It basically, for me, is a rubber stamp, the executive's rubber stamp. We saw a couple of days back, Treasury took to Parliament a proposal to establish a nominal cap to the debt, creating a nominal debt ceiling, essentially. And it just passed without any questions. And a number of other precedents have been set by the Parliament. Essentially, that have displayed Parliament as a rubber stamp of the executive. So on that basis, I don't see this. And also the makeup of the current politics.
Right.
Yeah.
Because everyone simply is acting like the government should not face any challenge
That's
whatsoever.
true in Parliament. And that's a big oversight on Parliament in its responsibility, on fiscal responsibility.
Well, we'll see how this plays out. George Bodo, thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate it. Right then, we're still in East Africa though. Tanzania has been ordered by the World Bank Arbitration Court to pay $185 million to the Hong Kong subsidiary of Standard Chartered Bank for breaching an energy contract. Now, the court's ruling does add pressure to the East African economy. It faces at least two other multi-million claims from international investors. The case stems from a legal battle between the Tanzanian government on one hand and the privately owned independent power producer IPTL, which led to the dismissal of several cabinet ministers some 5 years ago, back in 2014. Now, the award, however, is a lot less than what the claimant, in this case Standard Chartered Hong Kong, had actually looked for, $350 million. The government of Tanzania, however, has denied any responsibility. It says it's not planning to pay for these damages. South Africa's economy is struggling. Most institutions have scaled back their annual growth forecast since the beginning of the year. ABSA, for instance, one of the big four banks in the country, has just released a fourth quarter report that looks at the issues in the country's economy. The growth outlook, to put it mildly, is poor. The slump in business confidence will depress investment spending, and public sector balance sheets have no room to provide any further support. And at the same time, the consumer will likely be constrained by a weak jobs market, slowing income growth and administered price hikes. Here's CGTN's Angela Coppola putting the numbers together.
ABSA says they don't expect the South African economy to grow more than 0.6% this year. And as we near the reading of the medium-term budget policy statement by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni, there will be implications, especially on tax collections.
Our expectation is that it's probably going to announce that South Africa faces revenue shortfall of about 59 billion rand in this fiscal year. That's really massive, and it's not helped by the fact that on the expenditure side, you've had some pressures, and of course, the Eskom bailouts have added to that. The SABC bailouts have certainly added to that.
The country is also waiting to hear what the rating agencies have to say. The consensus appears to be that Moody's, the last agency to keep the country above junk status, will maintain its position. Most analysts expect Moody's to change the outlook to negative from stable.
Perhaps if Minister Mboweni is able to come through in the MTBPS and present a very strong, clear, credible plan for how to stabilize the situation at Eskom and how to actually bring down a budget deficit, maybe that may be sufficient for Moody's to keep the rating and the outlook unchanged. But that's not our base case.
The prognosis for the next 3 to 6 months is not a healthy one for South Africa's economy, and we're only expecting to see some light at the end of this particular tunnel in the next 12 months.
Over the longer term, there's probably scope to try accelerate some of this institutional rehabilitation that we have seen over the past 18 months or so. For instance, with state security institutions, we've seen some efforts to try and rehabilitate those. At SARS, for instance, we've seen some efforts to try and rehabilitate that institution. We've seen some governance changes in some of our SOCs. I think we'll need to see those efforts accelerated. But in addition to that, what we now also need, I think, is more real structural reform that begins to lift private sector business confidence.
I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Rwanda's Mara Group has launched 2 smartphones, describing them as the first made-in-Africa models. And they do give a bit of a boost to the country's ambitions to become a regional tech hub. Tonight, though, we'll take a look at another local brand here in Africa, the Egyptian mobile phone maker, and how it's doing in the market. Here's CGTN's Yasser Kim with their story.
The Egyptian brand Seiko is in its second year only. It has released 3 mobile phone brands and a tablet. 45% of the mobile's components are manufactured in Egypt, including the main board, the LCD and touch panel. The rest is imported from China. The CEO and founder of the company tells me this formula makes it relatively competitive.
There are 2 main pillars that we are building our competition strategy on. One pillar is the cost, as now the manufacturing in Egypt became much more cheaper than the manufacturing in China or India. The second part is most or fastest growing markets in this area are in Middle East and Africa. We have here a very good chance to penetrate these markets, especially that our devices are on the high quality and at the same time with very much affordable prices.
Most experts believe the mobile has fared well since its launch.
If we look at international brands like Samsung, Huawei and Oppo, they've been in the market for 10 years, while Seiko only 2 years. What you aim for at this stage is sustainability and to stay in the market. The next step is to begin planning to spread out and compete.
But in order to compete with the leaders of the market, there is still a lot of work to be done.
The Egyptian mobile has its small market share with loyal customers and consumers. I think the only problem is that the company doesn't have the ability to reach out. They have to be more aggressive in their marketing and sales campaigns. This is their weak point.
The Seiko chairman and founder has recently announced that there will be an extensive media campaign in African countries and Arab markets, hoping that this will increase the market share soon. Yas Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Now, today is the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. A report released last month by Oxfam shows that inequality on the continent is rising. The report shows how this rise is undermining efforts to fight poverty from essentially the north to the south, east and west. CGTN's Robert Nagila has more.
Titled A Tale of Two Continents, the report says 7 out of 20 of the world's most unequal countries are in Africa. Swaziland, Nigeria, South Africa and Namibia are named as the most unequal countries in the world. Inequality on the African continent traces its roots to colonialism, where political and economic power was concentrated into the hands of a few, a practice that's carried on to present-day Africa. The situation was further compounded by the debt crisis of the 80s and 90s, when much of the continent was subjected to structural adjustment programs, which entrenched inequality further. And the situation is not getting any better. Oxfam says the number of people in Africa living on less than $2 a day is increasing. And according to the World Bank, if current trends continue, 87% of the world's extreme poor will be in Africa by 2030. But it's not all doom and gloom. A European Commission study of sub-Saharan Africa found that education can be used as a tool to reduce income inequality. The study found schooling raised the income share of the bottom 80%, mainly at the expense of the top 10%. It also highlights progressive tax systems which tax the wealthy more, raising revenue that can be invested in social spending. South Africa topped the list of African countries' commitment to tackling inequality. Egypt came in 16th place, while Nigeria came in last at 45th. Its president, Muhammadu Buhari, has promised to lift 100 million people from poverty in a decade. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. The UK inches closer to leaving the EU after a last-minute agreement on Brexit.
No one again, he can hold in guns. Machine guns from police forces toward the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time?
Not at all.
What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
Welcome back. These are the stories making your headlines at this hour. In Ethiopia, some 400 migrants serving prison sentences in Saudi Arabia returned home on Wednesday. According to the Foreign Affairs Ministry, at least 32,890 Ethiopian migrants jailed in different countries have been returned home in the last 3 months. Today is International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. A recent report released by Oxfam shows that inequality in Africa is rising. And it goes on to say that the rise in inequality is undermining efforts to fight poverty. Inequality across the continent traces its roots to colonialism, among other matters. The situation has been further compounded by debt crises in the 80s and the 90s. The United States Africa Command has carried out multiple airstrikes in the past week on ISIL targets. The first strikes reported were in late September. They're believed to have stretched on into the month of October, though. A conflict over the control of Tripoli has left regions of the country exposed to a range of terror groups. And finally, here in Kenya, the country's President Uhuru Kenyatta has rejected a bill that seeks to retain caps on interest rates. Instead, Mr. Kenyatta wants lawmakers to scrap commercial lending rates, which critics say, when the data backs him up, has led to a credit squeeze. Mr. Kenyatta is in agreement with the country's Treasury and the central bank. Their argument is that the cap has cut private sector loan growth, and it says that banks essentially have avoided lending to clients altogether. And to run through your headlines. Now then, on to Brexit. The European Union has agreed to a new Brexit deal with the UK. Some call the measure a compromise. These are the initial details as we understand it. Northern Ireland remains in the United Kingdom's customs territory, but all EU procedures will apply to goods arriving there under a rather complex system. Now, unlike the backstop solution in the original deal, which was rejected at least 3 times by the UK Parliament, this system will not be replaced by a new free trade deal between the UK and the EU. Now, that does mark a big concession from the EU side. Both sides are aiming for a fairly ambitious free trade agreement post-Brexit with no tariffs and unlimited quotas on both sides. Previously agreed to settlements on citizens' rights after Brexit and Britain's divorce bill will stay as they are. Now, the European Union's chief negotiator on Brexit matters, Michel Barnier, has more details on what is agreed to in this new deal.
We have agreed on solid guarantees for the level playing field to facilitate an ambitious free trade agreement that is without tariffs and quotas. On this point, I would like to testify, having discussed this often when I've visited various parts of the European Union, to the fact that all member states, the European Parliament, national parliaments, and obviously businesses, the members of the business community whom I've met, have paid a great deal of attention and will continue to do so in terms of having a common pillar of standards that will apply at the end of the transition for social rights, environmental protection, state aid and taxation matters.
Right then, so the next 48 hours are going to be pretty frantic over in the UK. Let's get the latest on this. Richard Bestick joins us now live from London. So, Richard, aside from the details on how customs will flow around Northern Ireland, what are the main other differences, if any, between the deal arrived at today and the one that Theresa May had struck with the EU?
There are critical differences, but in large part, this deal that Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, has devised with the Michel Barnier, the Brexit negotiator in Brussels, is largely Theresa May's deal, 90% of it. The addition to the 600 pages that she negotiated over 18 months, the addition is only 60 new pages. However, Ramah, those differences are important. The opposition Labour Party here in Britain say they're very unhappy with the changes to the divergence, the regulatory divergence. In other words, the powers that the British government will hold to change trading standards and mechanisms as the years go by. The big difference, of course, is in Northern Ireland, where they now face a situation where effectively there is a border running down the Irish Sea between the mainland of the United Kingdom and the Northern Ireland province. And that is absolutely a no-go area for the Democratic Unionists, who hold a critical 10 votes, and they have withdrawn their support. So broadly speaking, this is the same deal as Theresa May came back with and had rejected 3 times, but it is different in critical areas. So we'll see just whether Boris Johnson has any more luck than Theresa May getting it through Parliament there.
Indeed, it will be rather interesting to hear what Theresa May has to say about the deal. But let's focus on the DUP. As you mentioned, they've made the rejection of this deal pretty clear. They, in fact, described it as a betrayal of the Belfast Agreement. But with respect to Ireland, where does the government in Ireland stand on this reworked deal?
The Taoiseach, the Prime Minister of Ireland, Leo Varadkar, is citing the negotiations over Brexit as a very good example of why it's important to be part of the Union. Ireland is a small agricultural community, largely, with a small population, nothing like the size or power of Britain, perhaps the world's 5th wealthiest nation. But all the time, the 27 nations of the European Union have stood by little Ireland against Britain's demands on Brexit. And Leo Varadkar says it's a real triumph that they should have been. He said it when he took up the job as Prime Minister 2 years ago. He felt that he was going to be, Ireland would be absorbed into the European Union. Nothing like it, he says. They've stood by him all the way through these Brexit negotiations, and he is delighted, he says.
Indeed. So the Prime Minister's predecessor had the deal she worked on for all of 18 months, shot down 3 times in the House of Commons, and she had a much bigger majority then. Given those facts, how likely is Mr. Boris Johnson to meet a similar fate?
The parliamentary arithmetic is very tight indeed. As I was saying earlier, he's lost those 10 DUP, Democratic Unionist votes. That could prove crucial. A few weeks ago, he sacked 21 members of his own parliamentary party for voting the wrong way. They've all gone off to become independents, and nobody knows how they're going to vote, whether they'll vote with him. The opposition parties, the Scottish Nationalists, the main Labour opposition, the Liberal Democrats, are all united in opposing him. If he managed to get it through, it would be very tight indeed. He's tabled 2 motions for Saturday. One is vote for my deal, the other is vote for no deal. He's not going to get that, and it's looking questionable as whether he'll get the support of Parliament for the support he needs to get this through.
Indeed. One last question for you, Richard. So walk us through what happens next. There's a deal on the table. Legislators reconvene to debate their options on Saturday. Can the UK still leave the EU by the 31st of October?
The UK won't leave by the deadline of October the 31st, despite the fact that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and all his ministers keep on saying we will leave by October the 31st. The reason, well, in place is something called the Benn Act. A member of Parliament called Hilary Benn has managed to get support for an act of Parliament which makes it illegal for Boris Johnson to leave the European Union without a deal unless he has the agreement of Parliament or whether Parliament agree a deal. So he's really trapped into that. The way ahead, well, as you say, for the first time in nearly 4 decades, Britain's Parliament is sitting at the weekend and they will be voting on the Brexit deal. It's really questionable whether he'll get it through. The next move from the opposition parties is either to bring down the government and force a general election, or for said second referendum, this time based on remaining inside the European Union or going with Boris Johnson's deal. But it's got to be said, Ramah, as I've said so many times in the past, nothing is certain and nothing is clear with Brexit, and that remains the same now as it always has done over the last 3.5 years.
Indeed, Brexit means Brexit. That enigmatic phrase comes back to haunt us. Richard Bessick there, live in London. Now, in the meantime, the Southern African Customs Union has officially signed an agreement with the EU to ensure that all trade agreements currently in place remain as is after Brexit. Now, the deadline for the UK to leave the EU, as you heard, is just 2 weeks away, the 31st of October. South Africa and its neighbours started negotiations with the UK last year, and at the time they were concerned that trade would be negatively affected after this divorce is done. CGTN's Zimtrade has that report.
The UK is South Africa's fourth largest trading partner. Any disruption to future trade will be detrimental. It's still not clear how Brexit will end, but South Africa preferred to be proactive in case of a fallout.
Beyond just trade in goods, extensive linkages in terms of services and investment. The UK remains an important historical investor in Southern Africa, including South Africa. So I think that there was economic, commercial reasons for trying to get the deal.
At the end of 2018, South Africa's exports to the UK was valued at $4.8 billion. Platinum and motor vehicles topped the list of exports.
And basically the agreement has been that cars assembled in South Africa will receive preferential kind of treatment, but it doesn't mean that all the component parts have to come from South Africa, which is a good thing. Because of large global value chains, we're seeing quite a lot of components being imported for assembly before we see exports, and this is likely to continue happening. However, South Africa, as long as a car is assembled here, is going to benefit from that. This means jobs in our manufacturing sector, which has really been struggling this year.
Wine, fruit and nut exports also contribute significantly to South Africa's GDP.
When we look at other industries, fruit exports, citrus, wine, and so we will continue to see some kind of smoothness because of this agreement in our ability to export our goods to the UK, which is important for the continuation of jobs, what jobs we already have in the country.
The latest deal will also allow SACU members South Africa, Namibia, Lesotho, Eswatini, Botswana and Mozambique to negotiate their own individual deals.
Any trade agreement's going to have to look or give concessions to, you know, what each country wants from each other. That's kind of how you do the negotiations. So as long as that there is some kind of give or take according to each country's requirements, and even if it's a broad agreement between, you know, us and a number of other SACU members and the UK, they can still specify different conditions for between the UK and, say, Mozambique.
Britain has just about 2 weeks to go before it has to leave the European Union, and no one knows how this will all play out. This is why it was an important move for SACU in securing itself in the long term, ensuring that it continues to have preferential access to the UK market. Sumitra Nadu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Good run through commodity prices here for you. We're going to focus on oil for the time being. Brent is hovering just under $90 a barrel. Some news in the oil space in the last hour or so. FT is reporting that the Saudi Aramco IPO, you remember that? Most anticipated share offering in, well, a very long period of time. That's been pushed off again. The idea was that we'd essentially have something starting, get the ball rolling from the 20th of October. That date now apparently has been pushed forward. We'll keep a very close eye on that story and update you on the developments. Here's what's coming up next. We'll introduce you to a Tanzanian artist who's cashing in on metalwork from waste and scrap.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Kanata, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome back. In Tanzania's coastal city of Dar es Salaam, it's impossible to miss the eye-catching wildlife installations at traffic circles and parks. The metalwork is created from waste and scrap materials by two disabled artists, Shukuru Lindunga and Saif Chembela. CGTN's Daniel Kijo has their story.
Giving life and beauty to what was once waste, the Liche Art Garage team creates works of art using metal from cars, motorbikes, bicycle chains, cutlery, and other leftovers of written-off items.
I look around at plants, humans, and animals, the way they live. When I get inspiration, even if it's on the road, the next day I have to make it.
The group met in 2004 and formed Wonder Welders to recycle waste metal to art. Later, the group renamed itself Liche Art Garage and now produces sculptures of animals and other items that are put on display in various parts of the city. One way to make a city more beautiful is to reduce waste. These men have found a creative way just to do that, turning scrap metal into works of art. They are changing the views of the city as well as their own lives. They get scrap metal from construction companies and residents around the city who collect and deliver to the workshop for free. The group also earns an income by selling the artwork and getting assignments to make pieces for clients.
It's beautiful. Scrap metals used to be seen as garbage, but now it's beautifying this area. Personally, I think it's really beautiful.
If only they did this in all roundabouts, it would be amazing.
So far, the team has 8 workers who are fully trained in the use of welding equipment. They say they hope to keep recruiting so more disabled people can be employed and Tanzania can be made more beautiful. Daniel Kijo, CGTN, Dar es Salaam.
All right, then a quick run through some currencies here for you. So the Kenyan shilling is still essentially at that 103.7, 103.8 level that it still continues to flirt around with for quite a while. Rather has been flirting with for most of the second quarter and the third quarter of the year. Some interesting developments on the debt side of things, however. The auction this week for short-term debt still displaying that skewed allocation of capital. Enormous demand on the 91-day paper, enormous demand on the 364 paper, virtually nothing in between. The coupon rates on both ends about 6.3 and 9.7% respectively. Those are your currencies, and that's it for tonight's edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on the programme in the last hour. There's several ways of getting your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.